What is the unique value of Ayn Rand's work on politics, and how can Christians benefit from it? I'm Cody Leibold. Welcome to the Americanism Book Study. This is the second of 9 meetings. We're meeting Saturdays through December 18th, 2021. We're studying a new textbook of Americanism, The Politics of Ayn Rand. This week, the focus is on pages 17 through 34, and if time, we're going to have a bit more discussion of the earlier pages as well, and the threads of conversations that may come up from you as you're watching. If you have questions or comments, you are welcome to come on camera or to put the comments in the webinar comment section. If you're watching this on YouTube Live or after the meeting, you have the option to join on this or upcoming webinars. Go to christianintellectual.com/Americanism to get the link to join. This is free, this is public. We are creating a discussion about what makes America America. This is a chance to sharpen your ideas and to practice expressing them. So I want to encourage as many people as possible to come on camera when you can, or express your comments in writing and I will read them. We are building a movement together. The Americanism Book Study is equipping future speakers and intellectual warriors. So go to christianintellectual.com/Americanism. Sign up if you haven't done so and find our replays there too. Let's get into our discussion. This is where we're going to begin. What is your definition of individualism? Now, if anyone wants to drop a comment in there, I can read it. What is your definition of individualism? And I'll offer my comments on those two possibilities. Looking for comments if anybody has time. So for one definition, this would be a personal concept that I've found. It says the habit or principle of being independent and self-reliant. The habit or principle of being independent and self-reliant. A different sort of definition is the social theory that favors freedom of action for individuals over collective or state control. So I want you to compare those two in your mind. Is this idea individualism, is it about a personal quality or set of qualities like independence, self-reliance, or is it about a social theory? Well, both of these definitions can be true, but the kind of individualism that we're talking about mostly in reading Ayn Rand's political theory obviously is the one that comes under the category of political theory, a social theory favoring freedom of action for individuals over collective or state control. Now, as you'll see in the discussion in the book, there's more precise definitions. Like, for example, Ayn Rand doesn't just say, well, it favors this, it emphasizes this, it leans toward this. That's not the way she thinks. Unfortunately, that's the way most dictionaries would describe the issue. But for Ayn Rand, she says that there is a way to decide if a society is acting according to the principle of individualism or the principle of collectivism. And the way she decides that is by asking, does the collective ultimately believe that, or does everybody believe that the collective has a claim on the individual such that they can redefine what his rights are? Or, on the other hand, does the collective believe that there is such thing as inalienable rights that can never be taken away no matter what it is that the collective decides it wants? If, in principle, people have decided that there is such thing as a limit on the power of the collective over the individual, then she would say that is an individualistic society. Now, we can argue about which those rights are. There's all kinds of discussions you could have about where the line is, but is there a line at all is the question that determines whether you are an individualist society or a collectivist society, and the archetypes of those would be the United States of America for individualism, especially in the northern states in the late 1800s, would have been an exemplar of what she would call capitalism, individual rights, individualism, whereas the opposite would be Soviet Russia, would be the absolute epitome of collectivism. All right, if you have your book with you, I want you to go to page 19. And as people are doing that, I want to invite anybody that has comments or that would like to jump in on video. This is an informal book study, and so anybody that's able to join on video at any point, I'm going to highly encourage it. I have enough content to get us for a whole hour of discussion, but I do think that for the most part, the value is going to come from if anybody is able to jump on video or if there's a back and forth at some point. not seeing anyone wanting to jump in right now, so I'm going to move forward. So looking at page 19, this is the beginning of the section that we're looking at today. We see about like 25 points, and then if you turn the page, a whole bunch more points. So it goes all the way to 41 points. And I just wanted to ask you guys, why did the questions get organized in this order? Why not some other order? I think that could be a helpful way of understanding what they're trying to do with this. So I'm just going to look at the first 8 points. I'm going to read them out loud here, and I'm going to comment on why they might be in this order in particular. So this was the original textbook questions, numbers 1 through 8. 1 says, what is the basic issue in the world today? 2, what is a social system? 3, what is the basic principle of America? 4, what is a right? 5, what are the inalienable rights of man? 6, how do we recognize one another's rights? 7, how do we determine that a right has been violated? 8, what is the proper function of government? Now, if you're trying to figure out why did they put them in that order, the answer is she's moving from the question of broadest significance to more specific. And as you read through this list of questions, you'll see that it gets to, okay, now that we've laid the foundation of this is the kind of perspective we have on political theory, this will be the next objection that might come up, or the next thing that's not clear. So she starts with number 1, what is the basic issue in the world today? And we talked about that last week. We talked about, like, is individualism really the basic issue in the world? And I believe that what she means is not this is the fundamental decision that everybody makes all the time in all of their life. But what she is actually arguing is that this is the question that society must decide, what society believes. We must decide whether we're going to be a society that upholds individual rights or not. And she says that's fundamental to the questions that society is deciding collectively. And I say that collectively, that doesn't even mean collectivism. Like the founding fathers of the United States collectively created a country, right? They worked together to do something. And the key decision that every society is going to be facing, probably for the foreseeable future, is there such thing as individual rights? So that's what she's asking. So what is the basic issue in the world today? She says it's between individualism and collectivism. Which is that question? Is really there such thing as an inalienable individual right? Does the individual have the ability to say no to the collective? So then she says, okay, let's talk about what the social systems are. And then the next question, number 3, is what is the basic principle of America? So now she's connecting the abstract to, she says America is an instance. Number 4, what is a right? Well, she's just digging in. And then what are the inalienable rights, and so on. So you can see she's explaining it in a way that's, I think it's useful. I point that out because this is different from the way much of the discourse takes place today. Much of the discussion that you hear online, if you're just reading New York Times, or if you're listening to Christian experts talk about politics, they just jump in midstream. And that's something that Ayn Rand does not do. And it's a lot of work to do the way she's doing it. Because honestly, not everybody is ready to just look at the sweeping picture in this way. And I mean, if you wanted to make a rhetorical point, or if you wanted to get clicks on your online article, you could do something like what Russell Moore has been doing this week, writing an article talking about, Christian nationalism and accusing people, Russell Moore is talking to CNN, leading political analysts, and he's explaining that Facebook has turned all of the Christians into extremists. And those are the kinds of topics that you could say that would get clicks. Whereas, if we write an article saying, let's talk about what really is the basic political issue in the world today, what is a social system? These are not the kind of things that you can easily wrap your mind around and have a strong opinion about, because a lot of people are not prepared for the discussion. But that's why we're doing this kind of book study. This will prepare you for that kind of discussion. All right, I'm going to skip ahead in the notes. If anybody has comments at this point, please put them in the message box, or let me know. You can raise your hand, come on camera. Okay, I see Rob. I'm going to go ahead and invite you on to video. And it's okay if you want to just do audio also. Okay, I hear you.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning.
So I guess as I'm listening to you and just thinking about this, I think as a Christian, the fundamental issue is does an individual person have infinite value or not? And if we were created uniquely, and especially by God, then the answer is, of course, yes. And I think that's the starting point that collectivists don't. I don't think they start from that point where the individual has a very unique and special value, and so it makes it easier for them to, to act against that individual by not acknowledging that.
Thank you for saying that. I agree. Is there anything you wanted to add? I've lost your sound. Are you there?
Oh, sorry. No, that was it. I'm just, as you were saying, when you get into online discussions with people, and it does start midstream, and you realize there's a foundation of beliefs that they don't have, or they haven't explored, or they don't agree with your foundation of beliefs. I think that's, how the conversation, you kind of talk past each other. But I think, having tried it both ways, I think if somebody's wants to engage in dialogue, having a good question at hand to make them stop and think, as opposed to me just telling them what I think is it's more constructive.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I agree. And I think that usually if you have a discussion where people are disagreeing with each other, you can ask people, hey, would you like to talk about what are the foundational assumptions behind the perspective that you're taking? And that will indicate whether they want to have a serious discussion or whether they just wanted to kind of share their opinion and move on. But if they wanted to have a serious discussion, very often you find out, hey, there are some assumptions. I remember one time maybe about 10 years ago, I was discussing something with two friends, and one of them seemed to be a liberal, one seemed to be a conservative. And I just pointed out to the two of them, you sound like you're discussing George W. Bush here, but you're actually disagreeing with each other about how do you answer this kind of question. So then I said to each of them, how do you answer the question of, in this case, I don't remember what the specific topic was, but what do you think is essentially at stake here? And when they began to look at those foundational assumptions, they could actually listen to each other. And that was an improvement in the quality of the conversation. And it turns out that when you ask somebody, hey, what are your concerns here? Those are usually things that we can actually agree are concerns, even if we disagree on the application. So that's valuable. Thank you for saying that. So let's go forward in my notes, unless anybody else wants to jump in on camera or on audio. I'd love to have anybody. Okay, I'm going to move forward in the notes. So, as I was looking through the first couple of chapters, some of the key ideas that came out were this thing called Americanism, individualism, individual rights, contrasted with collectivism, dictatorship. These are key ideas that unfortunately do not have a really good definition in the discourse today. If you were to ask Russell Moore, if you were to ask Ross Duhat at New York Times, what is individualism? What you're going to hear is, oh, it's just the worship of the ability to do whatever you want, anytime you want. It's the prioritization of whatever you feel like. And they even have this, this way of discussing individualism where it's called expressive individualism. See, they've had to qualify it because what they're really trying to critique is this idea that anybody can do anything they want because they feel like it. So the person that gets a surgery to modify their face so that they look like a dragon, that's expressive individualism. And the person who thinks that you should be able to keep your own property, well, that's individualism. And you can see that's a dirty trick to compare those two things. But that's what they're doing. So to clarify, to try to wash off some of that mud, let me just summarize a couple of ways of thinking about individualism versus collectivism. So Jacob Brunton has said in the past, collectivism just means that the group has priority over the individual, and individualism the opposite. The individual has priority over the group. And he explains there is a metaphysical reason for individualism. And I think this is what Rob was getting at in his comment that the individual has value. You have to ask yourself, when you're looking at social questions about how each individual relates to the whole group, what has metaphysical priority? And which is the primary? Does the group exist because its constituent parts are individuals? Is the group the unit of value, or are the individuals the unit of value? And which one is subjugated to the other? For example, would we treat the group as existing apart from the individuals? Well, no, the individual is the primary. And this is just metaphysically true. There are no groups unless there are individuals. You cannot have a group of things without having things. So you always have to ask yourself, a group of what? And when you start asking that question, then you'll realize that it matters how we interrelate the members of the group. If it's a group of bees, the kind of thing that an individual worker bee is the kind of thing that doesn't have the ability to do what a human being does, and that doesn't survive by doing the kinds of things that human beings do. So the collectivist way of organizing human beings is comparable to the way that a beehive is organized, or a colony of ants. It's comparable because what it requires is that everyone does one job, or the job that is required of them by the group, and the individuals don't have choice. That's suitable for a life form like an ant or a bee that doesn't have that agency, that doesn't have that mind. But when you begin to ask yourself, what is a human being? What is it capable of doing? How do human beings survive? The answer is by long-range conceptual use of the conceptual faculty. By planning ahead and by making choices is a completely different kind of a being than an ant or a bee. So that's important. So how should the individuals relate to one another? Well, they're going to need to relate by using their minds. And that's a point that Andrew Boone made in our video last week. That's something that Ayn Rand does, where she connects her position on epistemology with her position on politics. She sees individual human beings as having minds, and that being their means of survival, and that ties in to how we ought to relate to one another. So what we know as Christians, just kind of, if we can bring some biblical truth to bear on some of the things Ayn Rand has said, we stand before God individually responsible for our choices. The Bible talks about this as stewardship. Your life is the domain in which you are responsible to God. So if I were to impose force on somebody else and say, hey, you have to save this amount of money per year for retirement, like Social Security does, or you have to pay for my kid to go to public school, like the tax system does. If I impose force on somebody else, I'm interfering with their ability to use their own mind, to be a steward of their own life. And so it's actually depriving them of what God has given to them to be a steward over. And you're going to find that collectivism does that. Collectivism does that when you have public schools, or like I mentioned, Social Security. Collectivism does that when you require that somebody pays his employees X amount of dollars, like the minimum wage does. Collectivism says that if it helps the Black community, gain more money or affluence, then we should have programs promoting that Black people have abortions. That's collectivism, because they've treated the community as the entity of value, and they've said, well, and we can kill individual Black people, babies, in order to elevate the community. That's a collectivist way of thinking about it. If you say that you have a right to get your student loan forgiven, or a right to health care, or a right to maternity leave, all of these different kinds of things, they deprive the individual people making the choices and the individual people making the money of the ability to use what they've created in the way that they choose, and instead said that someone else has to choose. Someone else gets to determine where that money goes, and so on. I'm going to check for comments or any other, making sure I'm keeping up with the chat. My message box got a little bit obscured, so I need to make sure I find it. Okay, going to move forward. As I mentioned last week, we have an article at our Christian Intellectual website. It's called Squaring Individualism with the Church. And this is a topic that I think that anybody might want to just Google search Squaring Individualism with the Church by Jacob Brunton. And that's going to draw some connections that we discussed a little bit last time about, okay, so we know that the church is a collective. Does that mean that we should be collectivists? You can also find our podcast number 7, just christianintellectual.com/podcast007. It's called Against Collectivism. And That and then the following two podcasts, so it's 7, 8, and 9, are going to explain in a more general way how we understand these issues as Christians. If you're concerned, okay, what are the implications on the church and on Christianity for this topic? But I wanted to point out to you, just how attacked individualism is in our society today. So this is Ross Duhat in the New York Times, blasting individualism. He writes, "In the future, it seems there will be only one ism, individualism, and its rule will never end. As for religion, it shall decline. As for marriage, it shall be postponed. As for ideologies, they shall be rejected. As for patriotism, it shall be abandoned. As for strangers, they shall be distrusted. Only pot, selfies, and Facebook will abide, and the greatest of these will probably be Facebook." He wrote that several years back. That's what he thinks individualism is. C.S. Lewis had a lot better of a worldview than Ross Duhat, but C.S. Lewis thought individualism and totalitarianism were twin errors that ought to be navigated through. I found that at gotquestions.org on their article on individualism and collectivism. So C.S. Lewis said, well, individualism is a bad thing, totalitarianism is a bad thing, so we need the compromise way. Gresham Machen was of the same opinion, that you need to compromise between those two. He called them extremes. You need to go through the happy medium. You can look at Steve Spacek arguing that Christian individualism is an oxymoron. Does anybody remember Tullian Tchividjian? He believes that it's an oxymoron to be a Christian individualist. There's a man named Marcus Borg I found arguing that Christianity in the United States is typically far too individualistic because of the focus on where we as individuals will spend eternity. You can see this is the way that the progressives within the Christian movement are going to try to attack the concept of individual rights, and they're even going to end up attacking the gospel. But that's what they're going to do because they hate individualism that much that they would destroy the gospel in order to attack individualism. You can see this in the Episcopal Church. So in her opening address in the Episcopal Church General Convention, Reverend Catherine Jeffords Scory, the church's presiding bishop, made a special point of denouncing what she labels the Great Western Heresy. The teaching, in her words, that we can be saved as individuals, that any of us alone can be right in relationship with God. This individualist focus is a form of idolatry. You can read that in Christianity Today. Okay, I see, Isaac, you're raising your hand. Isaac, would you like to go on camera? Let me see if I can get you on camera.
Yes.
Make co-host. Sort of like a little process to get everybody on.
Cool. All right. So yeah, we're talking about squaring individualism in the church, and I wanted to find this post. I'm not going to be able to find it in time. Oh, I made that post. God is completely obsessed with himself. And our good friend David Pullman replied and says no biblical text anywhere. And eventually he gets to the idea where he says that he rejects the idea that God is self-obsessed. And I asked him what he meant by that. And he said that he agreed with the Cambridge Dictionary definition, which is only interested in yourself and your own activities. And I think when people think of individualism, they typically think they have this kind of definition in mind. It's like you're only interested in yourself, in what you do. You only care. Christians are supposed to care about other people, so they can't be individualists. Well, first of all, that's not really what individualism is, and we kind of touched on this in our last book study, where I think was it Andrew? I think clarified this. A couple people clarified it, but basically, individualism doesn't mean that you isolate yourself, that you're a hermit, or that you don't care about other people. But I think to illustrate this point, and this is what I replied to David Pullman, he's saying God isn't self-obsessed. Okay, how does he define self-obsessed? Only interested in yourself and your own activities. I said, well, David, for instance, I can be only interested in my activity of software development, but in doing that activity, it necessarily involves others. For instance, fundamentally, who am I making the software for? For other people to use. But I might also be developing the software with other people. Now, I'm not developing the software purely for the sake of others so that it can be used, well, I mean, I could be doing that. But that's not necessarily why I'm doing it. Personally, I love doing software development. I don't do it because of the opportunity to work with others or because it's something that somebody might use. I personally just love doing it. In relation to God, and my point was, God is only interested in himself and his own activities, but his interest and his activities include his creation. So I just wanted to draw out that point that when people think of individualism, they typically think like, oh, you only care about yourself or your own activities. Well, think about that though. Your activities include other people. Your interests can include other people. And that's a right understanding of individualism. That's a more correct understanding of individualism. When you realize that your interests and your activities actually include other people.
Thanks for that. That is really well said. I would suggest reading Isaiah 48:11, where God says, for my own sake, I do it. For how should my name be profaned? My glory I will not give to another. We have passages throughout Isaiah and the rest of the Old Testament where God talks about his own motivation for doing things. And his own motivation is for his name's sake, for his glory's sake. And there's passages that speak about God doing whatever pleases him. That's the kind of God that we serve. And it's because God is seeking his own pleasure. It's because he's seeking his own glory, and because we know that he will achieve that we're able to trust that, that if we're in the hands of that God, then we're in the hands of a winner. And that's an encouraging thing. So if you look at that passage and you say, well, he's only doing it for his own sake, that means he's obsessed. If you want to use the word obsessed, then use it. I think that the word obsessed is potentially, I think that it's just ambiguous. What does that mean? I think that might be David's hang up. But I think if we looked at the passage itself, we would agree that his primary focus is on his own name's sake, his own glory. So I think that when, like the way you were describing it, God is focusing on his own interests, but other people's interests can be part of his interests. For example, if you look at the passage in Hebrews 12:2, for the sake of the joy that was set before him, Jesus endured the cross, right? So for the sake of the joy that was set before him, it doesn't say for the sake of the joy of the people. It seems to be indicating that it was for the sake of Jesus's joy that he did it. But it certainly involved us. I mean, there would be no dying on the cross if it weren't for our sins and him paying for our sins. So that's one way of understanding it, is that he took joy in giving us joy. Those are compatible, but when you ask yourself, which is the fundamental, which is the one that he references as his primary? Well, it would be for my name's sake, for my glory, for the sake of the joy that was set before him, and so on. Go ahead if you want to add something there.
Yeah, a couple things. Just so on the tail end of that, I think of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane and his prayer to God. He doesn't say, oh Lord, I will do this for the collective sake, for the sake of the collective. And keep in mind, Jesus is asking God to take this cup away from him because of in Hebrews it says he despised the shame. And also realize what this means for Jesus. It means that he will be cut off temporarily from the love of the Father. And that is like to have known the love of the Father the way Jesus had known the love of the Father. And to know to be cut off from that is literally hell. it's hell. It doesn't get any worse than that. You don't want that. And Jesus certainly didn't want that. But there's something he wanted more, to obey his Father's will. And that's what gave him the most joy. And that's what should give us the most joy, is to obey the Father's will. So ultimately, Jesus said, Lord, if it be your will, take this cup from me, but not as I will, as you will. I'm paraphrasing there, but maybe somebody can correct me on exactly what he said, but I believe that's the spirit of it. To me, that comes across as highly individualistic. It's for the Father's sake, not for the sake of a general collective, of a general other or others. It's for the sake of God. And then I just wanted to touch briefly on the use of my word obsession. I think I agree with you. The thought that came to my mind, though, if I used a different word, maybe one that was more biblical, I'd probably go with consumed. God is consumed with himself. I think there's a text in the Old Testament that says he's an all-consuming fire. And I
It's
honestly,
also in Hebrews 12.
yeah, I
It's an
think
interesting
that,
connection there, because that's where the passage about Jesus is as well. It's that whole section there.
yeah, I think God being consumed with itself is possibly even more powerful than the idea that he's, self-obsessed. And I agree that that's probably too ambiguous. But the reason why I said self-obsessed is because people use it as a negative term. And so I was trying to intentionally sort of rub people the wrong way, but get them to think, well, could that be true? And in what way would that, if it is true, how could that be true? So, yeah.
Thank you for that. I'll read a couple of the comments that were put in the section here. This is from Ryan. He says, individualism, the kind that we're discussing, has no opposition to individuals participating in groups. They have the right to do so. And then we also have a comment from Rob. Isn't the voluntary stepping into a group or making a sacrificial choice the key difference versus compulsion and force? So he's pointing out to the voluntary stepping into the group, making a sacrificial choice. And sacrifice can mean a couple different things here, but we're talking about doing something that costs you something. That's all he means. So yes, the difference between whether you are being compelled or whether you're making the choice, whether you're associating voluntarily, by contract, by agreement, that's the whole difference that we're talking about here between individualism and collectivism. Collectivism is defined as when the group has compelled others. And then we also have another comment from Rob about individualism doesn't necessarily mean anarchy. And I think that's people's concern is, well, how will we have order in society? And he reminds us of this documentary, or, well, I think it might have been a video, a book, essay, combination of things, called I Pencil. And this I Pencil, you've got to look it up if you haven't. It just shows how, and he writes it shows us the beautiful harmonizing of individual action to meet societal needs, all freely choosing and making decisions. It's the story of all the different pieces that go into making even something as simple as a pencil, and nobody has all of the knowledge that it takes to do all the different things, and nobody has the economic ability to do all the different things. But working together, we're able to create great things, and that's how the order comes about. It comes about from individual agents freely choosing who they'll do business with and choosing the best price that's available globally. All right, and then Rob also mentioned the decision to love has to be a free choice. Ryan mentioned, is there any established terminology to distinguish between the truly sinful individualism, in quotes, in scare quotes, a true lack of generosity of participating in God's ordained groups like the church, and the biblical individualism that we're discussing? So he suggested terms like societal individualism or social hyper-individualism. I would probably try to remove the very term individualism from this, like, if there's a negative, because you already have collectivism versus individualism. I do know that there is the expressive individualism is one common term, and we just need to be able to say to people, hey, you've used the term individualism and you've attached another word to it, expressive, in order to make it something horrible. Well, that's not fair. I mean, imagine if we were to say that Russell Moore, is committing expressive gospelism. You can't just say, well, it's expressive, gospelism, and so that therefore that's wicked. Like you'd be messing with the concept of the gospel itself if you start doing stuff like that, because you're implying that there's some wrong way of doing it, and that's so, but it's still something related to the gospel, and so you'd be interfering with the actual core concept of the gospel. So the same way with individualism, don't try to redefine individualism, because you can't. You'll end up changing the concept. That said, if you're looking for terms for people, for example, that say that they don't want to be part of the church because they want to be all by themselves, the word for that is a schismatic. So you have a word for that. Now, what it is that society is critiquing when society tries to tell us, "Oh no, you're just clinging to your guns. You're a gun grabber." That we could just call ourselves constitutional conservatives who believe in limited government. That's the correct term for people like us. And they're going to call us hateful bigots. So that's how all the terms will lay out. Going through some of the other concepts, this is a comment from Ethan. He says, "We are not the direct object of God's interest." Oh, it moved. Let me find it. "That is his own glory and holiness. Rather, we are the indirect objects and beneficiaries of that self-interest of God." Well said. And then we have from Ryan, "Amen, Ethan. All individuals will eventually glorify God either willingly or unwillingly. Heaven-bound individuals will benefit God by displaying his mercy for eternity. Individuals in hell will glorify God unwillingly, eternally, by displaying his justice." Yes, and in one of the letters to the church in Thessalonica, we see God's glory on display in the condemnation of sinners. It's powerful language, and it's language that we don't often hear in churches today. It's as if we're afraid of what God has taught us about himself, afraid that people will find out that we believe it. But it should be preached. It should be preached far more than it is today. This is a question from Josh. He says, "Cody or anybody else, are you familiar with Carl Trueman's book on the modern self?" I haven't read it, but I am familiar with it. Does he make the same error of using the word individualism for a concept more along the lines of vanity or cutting oneself off from society or acting contrary to nature? I know this book has been really popular lately, and I suspect it may have something to do with Christians' resistance to the idea of individualism on top of all the Christian teachers naming it as an evil or a mix of good and evil for the last decade or longer. Go ahead, Isaac, if you wanted to answer that question or comment.
I haven't read the book either. I just wanted to quickly comment on that. Who was it who was writing that comment about asking the question?
That was from Josh.
Josh. He said that it was contrary to nature. And I just really like that idea that not associating with others, not interacting with others is contrary to nature. That's what this is all about. Individualism is natural. It's how we experience life as individuals. And this is what Ayn Rand's arguing. She's making an argument from nature. She's not a Christian. She's not referring to the Bible. She's referring to what she sees as true in nature. And it's natural for us to associate with one another. And so that's why individualism can't mean not associating with other people. That's not natural. We're coming from a place of, looking at human nature, what it means to be human. So I just wanted to draw that comment, that like little side comment. It just really stood out to me. He said, it is contrary to nature to not associate with one another. Sorry, I'm just interested to know if you know anything about Carl Trueman's book, though. If you have anything, if anybody else has anything to say about that.
Yeah, I have a little bit to say about it. Just wanted to piggyback on what you said, Isaac. There is a famous idea from Aristotle that man is the political animal. That one of the defining characteristics of mankind is that they relate to one another and that they work together to build things. And that he conceived of the ideal man as not being a hermit, separate from society, but as being a contributing member of a society. And I don't disagree with that, although I do think that the collectivists have often used that language and said, we're a collective. And obviously Plato was a collectivist. If you've never read his Republic, he is an advocate of communism, and most of the advocates of communism have taken their ideas from Plato. But Aristotle's idea of man as a, as a political animal just means that we have to, in order to build the kinds of things that we're capable of achieving, say in his days, ships, or in his days, enough farm produce that we can have time to philosophize and learn mathematics and study the stars. We have to work together for that. We have to specialize. We have to work in a certain kind of society, and nobody disagrees with that. So, getting back to the question of Carl Trueman's book, I think it's called The Rise of the Modern Self. Carl Trueman's book, I've not read it, so it wouldn't be smart for me to comment too much about it, other than to say I think he probably makes mostly true observations and then occasionally throws in language that suggests this idea of expressive individualism in a way that I would just dispute his use of the terminology. I know that Ben Shapiro recommended the book, and that Ben Shapiro is generally similar to me politically. I can't speak to everything about what he believes, but generally similar. So I'm not going to trash the book, but I'm not particularly a fan of Carl Trueman, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are passages in there that I would have serious issues with. All right, thank you for everybody that's been jumping in on the comments. Let me see if there's anything else that I wanted to. Yeah, let's see. I'm going to skim through one quick note. Okay, there's one note that I'm going to loop back to maybe for next week because I need to think about it a little bit more. So let me go ahead and just share with you a couple of other things that I've found about this topic of individualism, and then we can hopefully get more to the book as well. It wouldn't be a bad thing if we just spent the whole time discussing specific things within Rand's book. But let me point out to you how individualism is treated by Christians. So Jim Wallace of Sojourners magazine, a raging radical liberal, asks whatever happened to the common good, and he argues recommitting ourselves to the general welfare could solve the deepest problems of this country and the world we now face. Now, he's somebody who uses Christianity to advocate the cause of socialism and the forcible redistribution of wealth, and he does it very self-consciously. But it doesn't just come from the radical left. So you guys, think about our brother Stephen Nichols at the Ligonier blog. He's not a leftist at all, but he's still using American individualism in a similar way to these people that are coming at it from the socialist perspective. So Stephen Nichols laments American individualism as leading to the preference to worship alone. And is that a problem? Well, I would agree with him that it's a problem. People, for example, that would prefer to go to church over Zoom, like going to church over Zoom, that's not a gathering. That's not the whole point of church. But he writes, American individualism, seeded in our very beginnings and cultivated through our celebration of the rugged individual, has come to harvest. So he sees the fundamental individualistic idea that was advocated by the Founding Fathers as leading to people separating themselves, becoming either schismatics or negligent on their duty to the church, negligent on following Scripture. That's his perspective. And I give these examples because I just want to point out that anti-individualism is in the air everywhere. Christians of all backgrounds are progressively more vocal against individualism, and they agree that America's unique heritage is connected with individualism. And so now they're thinking, okay, individualism means I prefer to go bowling all by myself. I prefer to be a lone wolf. And in criticizing that mentality, they're actually going to end up, whether they know it or not, whether they mean to or not, they're going to undermine the legitimate pro-individual values that have made America a land of freedom and opportunity. So it is fashionable to condemn individualism. Those who are following this trend may not know that their ideals are going to return us to some old and stale statism. That's where we're going. The idea that the government should be taking away freedoms to create fairness or social justice, these are all old ideas. This is not new, but this is the direction that we're going to go in the United States if we keep on bashing individualism without being careful about our definitions. And I think that it is amazing, if you read through much Christian literature, how much emphasis these writers are putting on collectivist values. Like, for example, Christianity today. I mean, as many people know, they've been on a rapid decline. But it would be hard to find articles that were not explicitly antagonistic toward liberty, toward the founding fathers' vision for the Constitution, toward individualism. It'd be hard to find something that is not taking a crack at that perspective. So Christians with pro-American values, especially the right to life, the right to liberty, the right to property, inalienable absolute rights, you're going to find Christianity today to be horrifying. Here's some quotes from Christianity Today. The spirit of individualism rather than community dominates our culture, giving relativism a strong appeal. You believe what you want and I'll believe what I want is the spirit of the times. Or characterizing evil philosophies and relativism, moral relativism, characterizing that as individualism. These are the kinds of things that we see throughout Christianity today. Isaac, I see you have your hand raised. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, sorry, I was unmuting myself. So yeah, I have a couple thoughts, but I think something that was really crucial for me in understanding individualism and individual rights, and I want to preface this by saying that yes, there's a sense in which they're getting individualism wrong, right? When they talk out against it, it's this wrong idea that it's, hermit lifestyle or something like that. But that's one thing, right? The worst problem is that while they have a wrong idea of it and criticize it so strongly, they also bring in the true ideas and criticize those along with them.
Yes.
Like the ideas of individual rights, inalienable rights. And that's the worst problem. Like, okay, let's correct your understanding of individualism, right? But you're conflating these things and throwing the baby out with the bathwater, if you will. But what I wanted to say was, oh shoot, the thought's totally escaping me. Prefacing that, what was crucial for me to understand was when you're defending individual rights, it's not just about me and my rights. It's about everybody's rights. So there's this ironic twist about individualism where it's actually collective in a sense. When you defend individual rights, you're defending everybody's rights.
Agreed.
So there's this almost collectivist aspect to the idea of individual rights. When I understood that, I realized part of what it means to love my neighbor, to care about others and care about their interests, it means to defend their rights. And people twist this idea that if I say you have the right to live and live freely, that somehow means that they can do whatever they want. No, in a way it means that they have a right to live and be free, but that doesn't mean I then withhold my criticism of everything that they do, especially if they're a professing Christian. I'm going to criticize them if they say something heretical or if they sin. I'm going to rebuke them, depending on my level of relationship with them or what their status is. But I'm also going to die for their right to live freely. So it's important to understand the distinctions there and understand this collectivist aspect to individual rights.
Thank you for pointing that out. In the book, Rand mentions that would be the only kind of collective good that we could talk about, the public good. Well, the public good is the preservation of individual rights. And it may be actually in one of the future sections, so I'm not sure if it was Rand or one of the other writers that says that. But that's definitely consistent with how the founding fathers would have understood the idea of a public good. It's not necessarily just whoever says they're the public and the representative of the public. Well, moving forward in the notes a bit. So we've seen all these different Christians that are talking about individualism. And their idea of individualism is not the kind of individualism that this book is about or that we stand for at christianintellectual.com. So let me read a short quote from Rand. This is from the text. What is individualism? Do not make the mistake of the ignorant who think that an individualist is a man who says, I'll do as I please at everyone else's expense. An individualist is a man who recognizes the inalienable individual rights of man, his own, and those of others. An individualist is a man who says, I will not run anyone's life, nor let anyone run mine. I will not rule or be ruled. So this concept or this theory of individualism, I believe that Rand is right, that this is the fundamental question that society has to answer and that we're not answering. The church is not giving correct answers about it. Society is clearly moving toward totalitarianism, toward collectivism, away from individualism. Back when I first decided I wanted to start a website in 2014, I was thinking about it and I said, I want to advocate individualism. And so I actually, for a while, at the very top of the website, it said something about, I'm pro-individualism. That's what this website is for. And when I first got to know Jacob, that's the context in which Jacob Brunton and I got to know each other, because he has a website. At that time, he had a blog called The Christian Egoist. And, his theme was rational Christianity for those who love their lives. And then here I am talking about individualism. And so that was our point of connection. And he asked, okay, so is that the theme that you really want to organize your work around? And, different times I've decided, what do I want my work online to orient around? But it always does include individualism, because that concept has a reference to the individual mind and individual motivation and also individual rights. So if you were to look at all the philosophical landscape, including epistemology and ethical theory and political theory, it has bearing on all of those. And that is, I think I agree with Rand, that is the fundamental question that people are getting wrong philosophically today. It's not to say that it's the only thing that matters. Hey, I want to dedicate every waking hour of my life to teaching people about this concept. But if you are trying to help people philosophically, solve philosophical problems, usually those problems are going to relate to this concept. That's the claim that I'm making. All right, any comments on that before I move forward? All right, we didn't do a lot of reading in the book, but I wanted to at least bring up two topics that people have asked about in the comments this week and last week. Or maybe three comments. So let me read this one from Ryan. He says, with anti-individualism in the air, it's unsurprising that theology like that of N.T. Wright received an audience conflating ecclesiology and soteriology, de-emphasizing individual conversion and overemphasizing salvation of the group of the church. Yes, that was explicitly his perspective. N.T. Wright is a heretic. And that is one of the tricks that they use. And now this is a political question, more about, libertarian political philosophy. This is from Rob. He says, not sure where this question fits in discussing individualism with those hostile to it. They will often throw in examples at you to try to trap you. Many have false equivalencies. This one bugs me. How do you reconcile individual rights with the government seizing land to build the highway system in the 50s and 60s? No need to answer in this conversation. Just curious how you would respond. So I'll try to throw in just a brief answer. The government seized land using eminent domain. I disagree with eminent domain. There is a chapter in the Americanism textbook on eminent domain. So we can, and it's also referenced in other chapters, like there's the Supreme Court case against Kelo. And the overall objectivist philosophy on this is that eminent domain is inappropriate. And I agree with their perspective on that topic. That said, how would you solve the problem of the necessity of roads? Well, the road system, the highway system that was built in the 50s and 60s amounted to a giant government subsidy of the trucking industry, which is inappropriate. It ended up killing the railroad industry, which then the government said, oh, we'll need to take that over too, which then got even worse after they took it over. So you can see, there's clearly not an economic reason why they should have done exactly what they did. It led to damaging consequences to our economy. But as far as how would you create a system of roads? Well, if you've seen the libertarian memes, it's all about, like, everybody says, oh, who would build the roads? my perspective on that is that it's difficult to compare something that we have seen, which is the government creating roads, to something that we haven't seen, which is a society where individual people or corporations would come up with legal solutions for how to navigate the legal questions of rite of passage and acquiring land for roads. It's it's like, well, we've thrown trillions of dollars at solving the problem, and now let's ask, how could private people solve the problem if that had not have happened? It's difficult to do that, but it would obviously take trillions of dollars as well. It would just be run by uh, a different means by different people. I'll ask you this: like, if you've ever compared going to the grocery store to going to the Department of Motor Vehicles, who do you think is better at organizing things? Who do you think is going to make it so that the lines are shorter and more efficient? I mean, if you've ever gone to Chick-fil-A, right? I mean, Chick-fil-A is a wonderful example of how to make lines and queues work, and how to provide good service. There's hardly a case to be made that private entities could not do what the government can do. It's just a question of answering, like, how. And I'm not saying that that's always easy, but it wasn't easy what the government did in the 50s and 60s either. So just make sure we're comparing apples to apples when we can. Go ahead, Isaac.
Yeah, I think this won't be an amazing attempt at the question of how, but my mind goes to just the thought experiment of, well, what if we took away, if we just took away from everyone the concept that the government does anything at all for us? And imagine this happened 100 years ago. So we have 100 years of, if you want something done, it's up to you. And if you need help to get that thing done, you need to ask for help. After 100 years of this, I would imagine that society would get pretty good at communicating with their neighbors and working together individually, coming together to work together as a society to get things done. And with the roads thing, I just, it's pretty easy for me to imagine that you could have a society like again, this is removing the idea that everybody's convinced that it's the government that has to take care of the roads. If you take that away, it's now you and your neighbor. Oh, there's a hole in the street right outside, you know, our house. Well, it's also right outside the street of my neighbor's house. Knock, knock, knock. Hey, neighbor, we need to take care of that hole. I mean, we run over it every day. It's going to cost $200. You want to go 50-50 on it? And he'll say, yeah, let's see if we can get, Joe across the street to go in on it too. So to me, it's not hard for me to imagine, or, maybe Joe's the guy who does it, like who knows how to fill in that hole, right? So it's not hard for me to imagine how these things, and that's just like patching a hole, right? So we're talking about actually building the roads. Things would become much more localized. We would after 100 years of doing this, we would probably know the people who knows how to build roads. Like we would literally, oh yeah, that's what Joey does. His
Right.
family has been doing it for 25 years or 50 years or something like that.
No,
Those are the people we got, you know what I mean? So that's kind of where my mind goes to that thought experiment.
yeah, if you compare the U.S. Postal Service's efficiency to the efficiency of FedEx and UPS, I mean, there are solutions that can be provided by private organizations. Nobody today is asking, how would we have internet if the government didn't create the internet? Like, there are multiple in any geographical area. There are usually one or more internet providers or solutions because there is an economic incentive to provide that. And so, and even to the extent that the government is involved in it, it's getting worse, obviously. But the, if you ask yourself, how am I framing this? Am I assuming that it could not exist? That these these goods could not exist unless the government oversaw it. I don't think that that's a good way to frame it. So with the question of roads, I think usually it would be private organizations, like for example, the homeowners association concept. Like, because we understand, like I live in a neighborhood that has an HOA, and we understand that if one person decided to paint their house bright pink and every other house already looks within a certain style, that's going to be disruptive to our property value. So we have a collective concern here, right? Each individual in the collective has a concern, and so we have policies, and we agree to be members in this organization. And if we didn't like it, we could move away. And that's the way it would be with roads as well. There would be like a road owners association or something like that. I'm going to move on to a final question, and this is from Josh from last week. He asked, this may not be what you are asking right now. And this is a different Josh than the ones on the video right now, Josh L. So he says, this may not be what you're asking right now, but I'd like to submit this for discussion anyway. It seems that the rewards I keep hearing about only refer to eternal life, or eternal and afterlife rewards. Because we're reading all these passages about doing things for the sake of the reward in the Bible. So in the Old Testament, we see tangible, real life, here and now rewards and promises of blessings and abundance to those that trust in God and that live righteously. Maybe you guys can speak to that. Doesn't our self-interest apply to believing that God's desire to prosper us here and now, also eternally? Thanks for all that you do. So there is a difference between what we should expect if we are being told by God that, I'm going to create a nation out of you and I'm going to give you wealth, or I'm going to give you great wisdom and long life and wealth, as in the case of, say, Abraham or Solomon. They were told that that was happening. As Christians, we're told you will experience persecution. All that are godly will experience persecution. We don't know that God is going to make us wealthy, but we do know from the book of John that he prays that everything would go well for us, just as it goes well spiritually. So go well for us in all things, I believe is the verse. I won't Google search it right now, but you can look it up. It's right for Christians to desire prosperity, and it's right for Christians to pray for it, and to pray for it for themselves and for others. There's nothing in the Bible that would say that to be healthy or to have healthy kids is a wrong desire. That said, we don't know for sure what the consequences of our Christian faith are going to be in a hostile world. The promises to ancient Israel were promises to ancient Israel. If they had followed his law, he would have given them bountiful harvests. But we as Christians are sojourners and strangers in the world. We are not a distinct political nation. So we are ambassadors living in a hostile territory. That's just a different reality. And so we don't know. We're not promised the same kind of promises, that if we will follow all the Old Testament laws, that God will make sure that there's plenty of fish in the rivers and that there's plenty of rain. We don't know. Generally speaking, though, there are things in the Old Testament that we do know, and that is that God judges nations, and the kind of righteousness that we as a nation have, or the kind of unrighteousness that we as a nation have, are going to bring consequences. And I mean, that's just the law of cause and effect. We know that when Israel disobeyed God for centuries, that eventually, God was keeping count. And they paid for it with a captivity in Babylon that lasted for 70 years. For each one of the 490 years that they had been living disobedient to God, he kept track of the Sabbaths or whatever it was, and it was 70 or something. I can't imagine that, since God has the same character now as he did before, I can't imagine that there isn't some kind of connection between the kind of blessing that God gives us as Christians and our faithfulness to him. It's just, I wouldn't necessarily say, you go to church, you work hard, you raise your kids in the faith, and you should expect that you're not going to be persecuted. That's just not consistent with what we know historically about life in the Christian time. Go ahead, Isaac.
You brought up the idea of promises. We're promised eternal rewards. We know that. We don't know what our state will be in this life necessarily. But I would say that Jesus did essentially promise that we would suffer, that we would be treated as he was treated. The servant is not greater than the master. So, we should actually expect suffering. Now, that doesn't mean the problem that we see, that our group, I think, sees with Christianity today, is that we're so overly focused on this life, and the idea that Jesus said that we would suffer, as if suffering is a good thing. It's not a good thing. We don't love suffering. Whenever Jesus talks about suffering and how you're persecuted for righteousness' sake, look for him talking about reward. Almost always, I could probably say always, whenever he's talking about how you'll suffer for righteousness' sake. And I'll also keep in mind, it's not suffering, period. It's suffering for righteousness' sake. Because you can suffer for doing something evil. You're not going to get a reward for that. But here's what I'm saying. Always look for that reward statement, because Jesus usually follows it up with that. And it's about eternal reward. And that's what our faith is in. That's what our hope is in. Yes, it's not wrong to want earthly desires, to want earthly gain. It's not wrong at all. And we should pray for that, for ourselves, for our family, and for others. Because suffering is bad. It's not good. There's nothing good about suffering. But what makes suffering good, what can make suffering good, is when you suffer for righteousness' sake, there will be a reward for you in heaven. God says that he's making all things good for the somebody. Cody, you hop in here and tell that verse, because I'm totally blanking on it. But all suffering for the good of those.
All thing works together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose.
So we have faith in that verse. We hope in that verse that the suffering that Jesus essentially promises that we will experience is going to work out for our good. That's my take on that.
Thank you for that. There's just one other comment that I'll read, and then I think we can go into wrapping up. So this is a comment from Ethan. He says, this might be a little off topic, but in the book of Genesis, when Joseph had charge over Egypt and the 7 years of the famine came, he did not just give out the collected grain according to the manner of each person's need. Rather, he exchanged the grain for goods that people paid. He recognized private ownership of goods. The government was not responsible for taking care of the people. They paid for the grain, even in an emergency. That is correct, and eventually people ended up selling their land. And so that is how the pharaohs of Egypt became so fabulously wealthy, is because they ended up owning all the land eventually. People had to sell something in order to get that grain. Yeah, I mean, I've looked at that instance in history of Joseph saying, we've got to collect all this. And I think that he taxed the people at a 20% rate. So in the 7 years of good harvests, 20% of the grain that was grown was collected. I think that's just if memory serves. So you could perhaps argue from there that if there is a national emergency, we're talking about everybody's going to die, that the government could impose a tax. And that's different from when you're not in an emergency situation. Life itself is not an emergency situation. People living in one location where the temperature is 5 degrees hotter on average than somewhere else, that's not oppression, okay? This is not the kind of thing where we should redistribute wealth. What Joseph did not do was look at every individual person in his nation of Egypt and every family and every societal group and compare them all and say, oh, well, you have slightly darker skin, therefore you've been disadvantaged, or something like that, and try to recalculate and redistribute the wealth. One of the major problems with redistributing based on the central planning model is that the central planner is just not God. He just doesn't know how people came about the wealth that they have. He doesn't know whether it was gained righteously or unrighteously. And for him to try to micromanage that is to remove from society the ability of each person to make their choices. But the people that are making the individual choices, each individual is closest to the specific situation. They know what's valuable to them. They know what choices to make. And so The central planning model ultimately deprives people of that, which, I mean, it kills the ability of the market to convey information about value, which that in itself is, if you read Thomas Sowell about the Soviet Union, it's just devastating to productivity when people cannot assess value. You'll have too much of one thing and not enough of another. That said, I think that what Joseph did in Egypt was obviously what God wanted him to do. He did the right thing in that situation. So, some people have tried to say, hey, Cody, taxes are not always bad according to the Bible. And so maybe this is a discussion that we could get to in future videos. Like, so do you really believe that taxation is theft? Like all taxation, all types of taxation, all uses of taxation? In what sense do you mean that or not mean that? I think that will be an interesting and perhaps a big conversation to have. But I'll say, I believe that the kind of taxes that we have today and the kind of things that they're being spent on today are unrighteous, and we can get into more detail about that as time goes on. We keep getting more comments, so let me read this from Ryan. He says, and I'm not sure what he's referencing, but he says, it's analogous to the church's care for true widows when the jurisdiction of the family is no longer able to fulfill what is primarily their duty. The next jurisdiction can step in. But notice it is only when truly life and death. And then he quotes 1 Timothy 5, honor widows who are truly widows. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents. For this, it moved. Let's see. For this is pleasing in the sight of God. If that person is no longer in need, the church needs to step out of the way. Okay, yeah, just comparing that policy to Joseph's. Hey guys, I've got to wrap up. So thank you for joining today, and we can continue these discussions. It's really an honor to be able to meet with you and be connected with you in this way. Just let me give some information for people who would like to join these in the future. So you're able to find all of our replays at christianintellectual.com/Americanism. And you're also able to join on the webinar. You can sign up for that at that same link. It's not too late to join. If you've noticed we've met twice already, we have 7 more meetings. You can jump in at any time. You don't have to be there for every meeting. And just keep in mind, these are informal. So it's okay if you show up and you have your family in the background. I'm not worried about that. Getting to know each other is the goal. And building a foundation for future things, practicing articulating these thoughts. So this is a great time to get involved. This is, I think, a really cool, different way that you can get involved. So if you'd like to do that, go to christianintellectual.com/Americanism. Also get on our email list, christianintellectual.com/subscribe. I want to thank you for joining today.